Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, another Survivor ranking here, but this one not based around gameplay or individual episodes. Here we'll be ranking every Survivor auction from Survivor US. And to me, I always found the auction to be a really fun event over the course of Survivor's history. Obviously, recently, Survivor US has stopped doing auctions, which I do think is a shame, but I did like how the auctions usually brought out a lot of fun character moments, which can also bleed into the game as well, with some pretty big gameplay moments happening at some auctions, and also us getting to see more of the dynamics between the players, and really just feels like a bit of downtime most of the time for the players. That was a fun element of it to watch. And while the tone of auctions over time became a lot more serious, considering how more game heavy it had become, I always still really loved the Survivor auction. And here we'll be ranking every Survivor auction from Survivor US. Again, there are 16 to be ranking here, which cover the first 30 seasons of the show. So again, there was an auction over half the seasons up until that point. Again, kind of a travesty. There hasn't been any since, but whatever. And again, this will be my personal ranking on how much I enjoyed watching them. I literally rewatched all of them right before making this video. So let's start off the list at number 16. The bottom of the list to me is actually the first auction of the show. It is the Australian Outback. And this is kind of a shame to me because I did expect this one to be a little bit higher considering the reverence it has for it being the first, and also just the surrealness of this scene considering how ridiculous some of these items are. But again, on the rewatch, while I didn't disenjoy watching, I think this is still a solid scene of the show. I do feel like it felt pretty mundane. I mean, I don't think there really is much interesting really going on here. I mean, again, there are some ridiculous items, like 4 Doritos and salsa is literally the first auction item ever, which is just kind of ridiculous. Something else I didn't love about this is that Jeff also has like preset starting prices, which are all like relatively high. So I mean, we see like 4 Doritos going for $60. Nick gets 3 crackers for $120. Can of Mountain Dew goes for $80. I mean, there are some ridiculous prices here. I also feel like the entire scene is being portrayed in this more like wacky style where like there's like hillbilly-esque music going on in the background. And it very much feels like this is just a joke to production. And while the auction and just in general is obviously this like kind of ridiculous concept, I do feel like how much the show doesn't take it seriously here adds to me enjoying it a bit less. Also, I do feel like it's a bit rushed over. I mean, we get so many items just being montaged on this auction without much point to it. I mean, like we'll get to another auction later on, which has a relatively long montage, but I feel like that one had more reason to it than the Australian Outback here, where here it's literally just them skipping it over. And overall to me, again, like I don't think this is a bad scene for the show. It's certainly better than almost every other reward challenge in the history of the show. But again, at the end of the day, in comparison to the other auctions, I do have to have it here 16. Now number 15, moving on to one that I thought would be higher because this is actually the first auction that had any sort of game significance to it, but I didn't find the actual auction as a whole that interesting, and that is the auction from Survivor Guatemala. Now again, this is the first auction to involve a advantage in the game. Danny ends up buying an advantage in the immunity challenge, which essentially ends up handing her the immunity win, which ends up leading to her winning the game. As she was in danger this round, she surpasses it and navigates to her end from there. And like, if it had not been for that, she probably goes home. And if not, then in a lot more danger for sure. So again, Guatemala's auction definitely plays a factor into the season from a gameplay standpoint. The problem is that beyond that, it's just not that interesting. I mean, right away, we see like the first item be beef jerky, and like Danny's the only one to bid on it for $20. And that's just kind of underwhelming. We see like Cindy get milk and cookies. We see a bit of intrigue from like Danny and Rafe teaming up against Lydia to get a mosquito net, but even then they don't end up getting it. And we get this really awkward scene from Jeff too, where he calls out how many mosquito bites Lydia has on her back, which is just kind of weird. And we do have a bit of a bidding war also between Rafe and Danny and Steph and Judd for a Philly cheesesteak, and that's fun. But really, I mean, this is a relatively short auction, largely because the end of it revolves around the family visit, where we once again have a bidding war between Steph and Judd, where, I mean, essentially Lydia gives Steph all of her money and Cindy gives Judd all of her money, and it turns out Judd has more. So Judd gets the loved ones, but then also gets to pick 2 people, and he picks Cindy and Steph, obviously. I mean, again, it's whatever. I do think that back portion of the auction definitely slows things down, as it's really not that interesting to watch, and considering there aren't that many notable moments from the auction itself, outside of its importance in terms of it containing the first ever game advantage and also later leading to Danny's win, it's really not that entertaining of one, so it's here at 15. Now number 14, moving on to a pretty baseline auction to me, one that I don't have many issues with, but it also just doesn't have that many notable moments either, and that is Survivor Palau. And again, I mean, it's a pretty baseline auction. People are buying stuff. There's some fun reactions here and there. It's mostly just fine. I mean, I did find it funny how Jen buys the first item, which ends up being a sundae, and at the moment that they reveal that it's a sundae, we get this like heroic music playing, which just seems kind of ridiculous. We do have a bit of a bidding war between Ian and Greg and Steph and Karen over a covered item. When Steph and Karen win it, they are given a choice to switch, and they end up smelling both of the options. That's like kind of a notable moment, but like not one that's that interesting. We also have another bidding war between Ian and Katie and Jen, with Greg coming in at the last second to offer $20 for a bite to help Ian out there, with it turning out to be spaghetti and bread. And there's a lot of focus on like Greg like really making sure that he's gonna get a bite out of it, which kind of comes off as humorous to me. We also get this weird scene where like Jeff tells Ian how much he smells, which is just like, again, really weird that's on the show. But really, again, like the Guatemala auction, this auction is very much focused around the letters from home, where at the end of the auction, that is the final item. And right before the auction, Tom does get a decent amount of content talking about how he needs some food for the soul, and obviously he ends up winning the letter here, which ends up being a strong moment for him. You also get some focus on Stephanie getting her letter, and like again, like to me, it's like whatever. Like I don't really care that much. Again, like it's a pretty baseline auction. I don't have many issues with it, but I also don't have many pros either. It's here at number 14. Now number 13, moving on to a similar auction, but I feel like there's at least a couple notable things from it that make it stand out to me, and that is the Amazon. Now again, for the most part, very baseline auction, especially in terms of what's presented on the show, where I do think something that makes this a bit more interesting to me is the context from outside the show, where supposedly the cast had made an agreement before the auction to not bid against each other. So when they get to the auction, that's why Heidi gets the cheesecake right away without anyone bidding against her, and you can clearly tell Jeff is annoyed the entire time, which makes this even more funny. And supposedly what happened is that Jeff got annoyed to the point where he decided to make everything a covered item from that point forward, which does lead to more bidding. But again, it is a mostly baseline auction beyond that. I mean, we do get chocolate and peanut butter coming up again, and there being this like salacious music, which I just found like kind of weird, because it's really weird just in retrospect how much the Amazon was focused around this like sex sells philosophy that kind of just makes it awkward nowadays. Another humorous moment here though is Butch winning scrambled eggs and pancakes, which we get Jeff doing something that he does in another auction as well that I did also find to be a humorous moment of him asking, where's the best place to have breakfast? And again, humorously in real life, supposedly the first thing Butch said was Cracker Barrel, which is also funny. But on the show, we see him saying at home with the wife and kids, and Jeff is just like, again, clearly annoyed here. And he also responds immediately afterwards and saying in bed, which is just so awkward. But through this, he ends up obviously giving him bed because obviously he was referring to bed and breakfast. But still, it's such a weird scene. But again, like the Palau auction, this auction does also end with letters from home, where Christy ends up winning the initial one. But then we get a lot of dramatic music over Jenna crying over obviously not getting her letter, considering obviously she had a mother with cancer back at home. And this leads to Jeff offering up another letter. And like, if this scene had just played out as normal, this would be like kind of a nothing scene to me, and kind of like the Palau one where like, again, cool for the people there, but like to me, it's not that interesting of TV. But something I do find very humorous is how Heidi bids against Jenna for the letter, despite Heidi supposedly being her like closest friend and knowing all the struggles that Jenna is going through. She instantly bids against her. It's just hilarious to me. Again, to me, the Amazon auction is a very baseline auction, but does have little moments. Mind you, a lot of them are from behind the scene that make it humorous. But again, even then, I still found it more entertaining to watch, and because that is here at number 13. Now number 12, we're moving on to an auction that, I'll be honest, like I thought was going to be higher. For some reason, I remember this auction being pretty strong. And even when I finished watching it, I did place it a bit higher. But then when looking at the list again, I did have to bump it a bit. And to be honest, even now, I think there's probably a debate for it being below the Amazon. Again, another mostly baseline auction here. We do have the auction from Survivor Samoa. And again, like there isn't that much notable about this auction. However, I just remember having fun watching this auction back in the day. And even now, again, it's still a fun auction. I mean, you have moments like Shambo winning sea noodles and slug guts and her asking about its nutritional value. You have Russell being wrong, where he says that he thinks that there's going to be 2 bad items in a row, only for the second item to end up being an entire roasted chicken. You have a couple of advantages being given away here, with Fincher betting on both of them. However, him only getting the idle clue, which is entirely pointless considering Russell already had it, but also going for advantage in the immunity challenge, which Jason ends up going all in on, which ends up giving him immunity later on, but then he instantly regrets it, where he sees Mick getting burger and fries immediately afterwards, which I found the humorous moment. We get the shower being up for grabs, which is something that was pretty common in this era of Survivor, and I actually find it really awkward, especially because, again, they're like playing it up of like, oh, we need a young, attractive woman in there, and like Natalie ends up winning it. And they're playing like sexy music as she's showering, and that's just really awkward. But again, for me, like probably the biggest moment from this auction to me is John and the apple pie, where I love this moment where he buys a slice of apple pie, but he gets the offer of giving an entire pie to 4 other players while he would get nothing. And then he immediately asks, is anyone stoked on pie? Which I always found to be a humorous quote. And in a move that I don't think anyone else does in the history of Survivor, he actually decides to not share and decides to keep it to himself. And he like openly talks about how he's going to take it because he doesn't think anyone's going to vote me out because I didn't give them some pie, which obviously doesn't end up being the reason he's voted out, but it is humorous that he is voted out later this episode. Again, like to me, I do feel like there's some humor from this auction, but at the end of the day, it is a pretty baseline one. To me, I could see the debate between this and Amazon being higher, but I do have some reverence for this one, so it's here at number 12. Now number 11, we're getting onto an auction I feel like so many people have as one of the best auctions of all time, and I thought it was going to be too coming into it, but I'll be honest, did not love my rewatch of it. And here at number 11, we do have Survivor Tocantins. And I will say, again, like I did take notes for every auction over the course of this process of making this video, and Tocantins is literally the auction I had the least amount of notes for. To me, the Tocantins auction is a very quick one. Like there is very little to chew on the Tocantins auction to me. It does have 2 very notable moments though. Obviously, you have the Debbie moment where she doesn't know $20 increments, which is funny considering, again, she's a principal. But then the other moment's obviously this big Taj moment where she wins a message from her husband and he says, see you back at camp. And like we have this really emotional moment of her figuring this out. But then also we give this like fake dilemma to her that really just felt like them trying to add this like fake drama to the show where she gets the choice of like her getting her loved one back at camp or everyone else getting their loved ones back at camp, and she still gets her loved one on exile, which is probably a better reward anyway. Again, this was just a pointless dilemma to me, and one that, again, like it just feels like it's really forced in there. I really didn't like that element of it. I do feel like it takes up a good chunk of the auction. Like it is one of the most notable moments of the auction. But it's really a scene that I'm just kind of overall mixed on as a whole. And again, outside of that, it's really just not that notable of an auction. Again, you have like Coach winning chicken parm. You got JT winning nachos. You have Steven getting a covered item and turns out to be chicken hearts. And again, it's a relatively baseline auction. So again, for me, while it does have really notable moments, it's really just not that entertaining of one in the grand scheme of things to me. So it's here number 11. Now number 10, we're moving on to an auction that I thought was going to be higher as well. And it's not that I disliked my rewatch of it, but I just felt like other ones were stronger. At number 10, we do have Survivor Philippines. And again, there are some fun character moments in this auction. I mean, I think right away we get some fun from Denise going all in right away to 500 for some pancakes and bacon. And then we immediately follow that up with Scoopin', who had just complained about her going 500, saying that, oh, you can get that for $1.99 at the local diner. He goes 500 right away for next item without even seeing what it is, with it turning out to be like cheese and crackers and wine, with him not even drinking wine. And like, to me, that is a really humorous moment for this auction. We have like Penner winning fried chicken, and we have this like ridiculous moment between him and Jeff, like after Penner bites into the chicken that just felt really awkward. Carter ends up looking pretty good through this auction with him initially buying a baked potato, but then getting the choice to trade for rice and beans, which he obviously does. But again, this always felt like a fake dilemma to me. Because again, like who would not pick the rice and beans? Though, I mean, I guess you have your John Finchers out there. But he also ends up at the end of the auction getting veal shanks for the entire tribe, where the entire tribe gets to eat it over a 60-second time period, which again was a very common occurrence for the auctions around this time, and that's how they used to end these, which I always found to be kind of an awkward way to end the auction. I mean, yes, it is satisfying in the sense that everyone is getting food, and everyone's like leaving on a happy note, but also feels weird where we're seeing these people like really devour these like random things of food over the course of 60 seconds. And again, especially like veal shanks just felt like a random choice here. But really for me, the most notable moment of this auction to me is probably one of the ones that doesn't lead to much over the course of the auction itself, is that Abby ends up buying the advantage in the immunity challenge, which ends up leading to her winning it. But again, it doesn't really play that much of a factor on the auction itself, outside of like her saying that there's not much compassion for me here, so I have to have compassion for myself, which is kind of a funny line. But again, overall, like, it is an auction that is strong, and there are fun moments here and there, but to me, it's not as consistent as the next few we'll be talking about. Tier number 10. Now, number 9, moving on to the very next auction that happened. At number 9, we do have Survivor Caramoan. And again, this is in a similar tier to me, and they're very similarly structured auctions. At the beginning, we have a humorous moment, just like with Scoopins in Philippines, but here of Malcolm, where right before the auction, he talks about needing an advantage and how he's going to not have to buy food, only for him to literally buy the first item, where Jeff says the first 20 gets beer and pretzels, and Malcolm just instantly gets it. And we also have this like weird moment immediately afterwards where like Malcolm just chugs a beer in front of Jeff, and like Jeff's like clearly like proud of him. It's just like really, really weird. We have Reynolds getting the option to switch between 3 different options, and Cochran tells him it's the money hall problem and that he should always switch, which is technically not the money hall problem in the sense that the money hall problem involves you knowing one of the 3 options isn't correct, but whatever. But this does lead to Reynolds ending up with only 1 slice of pizza, while Sherry goes 500 for the rest of it, which seemed weird because the pizza looked disgusting, if I'm being honest. And she like instantly talks about how she doesn't care that she's out of the auction. And the same thing goes for Dawn immediately afterwards, where she goes 500 for a roasted chicken, which ends up biting him in the butt at the end of the auction, as everyone gets letters from home, with the exception of Dawn, Sherry, and obviously Malcolm as well, which again is kind of a humorous element of the auction. Again, Malcolm also spends the rest of his money on an idol clue, which I found it really BS how they gave him the idol clue here, where like in most situations, obviously you get the clue and get to keep it. Here you only got to look at it for 60 seconds. And it's also dumb too, because they end up giving this exact same clue to Andrea in the next episode anyway. So it's like, why didn't you just give him the clue? Throughout this auction, we do also have this like humorous plot line around Brenda, with Brenda being annoyed whenever people outbid her, saying that she doesn't want to take the risk, only for her to eventually take the risk, going 300 on a covered item, and it ending up being pig brain. And then she like ends up eating it and says that she just remembers she doesn't eat pork, and like this is just a really awkward scene also. But again, like the other auctions around this time, it does end with Eddie buying peanut butter for the entire tribe. We get 60 seconds to eat it, but through this we get a Cochran-Jeff bromance moment, with Cochran eating peanut butter off of Sherry's fingers, and Jeff asking him, how often does that happen? And Cochran says, more often than you think. Again, like a moment that you can clearly tell that this was like Jeff trying to prop up Cochran's growth arc across the season. But again, like really, it's a good auction. It's a very strong auction. Again, similar to Philippines for me. But to me, it does have stronger individual points here and there that do land it above it at number 9 here. Now number 8, and at number 8 here, we're moving on to an auction that, again, is another one that I think most people state is one of the best of all time, and it is very strong, but it did not quite reach the upper echelon to me. And at number 8, we do have Survivor Micronesia. And again, to me, like Tocantins, I don't have that long of notes about Micronesia. To me, Micronesia is also another relatively short auction in terms of the actual events within it, though it does have some really notable moments here. And we obviously see like Natalie end up accidentally buying bat soup and James saying that he'll eat it instead. And really Natalie ends up getting all the notable purchases here, with her also buying the advantage that allows her to send someone to exile, to which we have like Jason begging her not to pick him, only for her to pick him anyway. I did find this scene also kind of weird, where like Jeff confirms to the entire cast that Ozzy was voted out with an idol, so that there'll be an idol hidden on exile, which felt weird. I mean, like I assume probably everyone knew that Ozzy had an idol at this point, but again, it felt very loosey of Jeff to just openly say that Ozzy was voted out with an idol. But we also get the chocolate cake scene, which is probably the most notable moment of this auction, where Natalie ends up winning chocolate cake again for 60 seconds, but this time not with the entire tribe, only with 3 other people, to which she picks Parvati, Alexis, and Suri. Again, really ostracizing Amanda here. This leads to just kind of an awkward scene. I really don't love this scene from a TV standpoint. It just feels really weird to see like Natalie having this like massive chunk of cake in her hands as she like bites into it. And then we have like Eric offering to pay money to lick it off their fingers, and that's just weird. Obviously, eventually ends up licking Cerie's fingers, and that's like a notable moment, but like to me, it's more so an awkward moment than anything. And really, overall, again, like this is a fun auction. There definitely is a fun energy to it, but it's one that, like, again, like I don't think is overly strong outside of these like couple moments I pointed out. Like beyond that, it's pretty just baseline. And to be honest, I would even debate that both Caramoan and Philippines would be above this. But again, I do feel like the dynamics between the people there are pretty fun, and that leaves it here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a very different auction. This is the auction that really stands out just due to obviously its very different structure. And here at number 7, we do have the auction from Survivor Thailand. Now, Thailand's auction is a really weird one, obviously with it being the only tribal auction where it is 2 tribes betting against each other instead of individual players. It is in the pre-merge. And to be honest, probably my favorite moment of the auction comes from before the actual auction. I mean, rewatching this scene right before the auction though just really made me laugh. This entire scene of Jan getting tree mail. Instead of telling Chugan about what the letter says, she keeps on counting the cash and yells out American, and Clay is just like looking at the camera and mocking her, and then proceeds to say no shit Sherlock after Jan says it's a gambling thing. It's really fun. I love that scene. Like, as much as Clay is a questionable person, I do think this is one of my favorite moments of the entire season. But I mean, to be fair, it's not technically part of the auction, it's technically beforehand. So again, like when it comes to the auction itself, it is interesting in the fact that it starts off with the players getting the choice to mutiny, which is bizarre. Again, like obviously the only time the mutiny was actually utilized was in Cook Islands, but it is interesting that it is here on the show in Thailand. Obviously, like we know that it was offered to the players on Pearl Islands as well, but just they didn't air it because it didn't end up leading to anything. But it is interesting that it is here. But beyond that, again, like it's just a mostly standard auction, but just one with very interesting dynamics because again, it is a tribal challenge technically. Like it is funny to see like the first item is a burger and fries, and Sukchai ends up buying it, and it's literally gone by the time the next item is sold. We have Sukchai also accidentally buying grubs, which leads to Stephanie eating them. And she ends up like giving one to Aaron, who actually eats one as well, which is just kind of weird. This is another auction that has the reveal of a hot fudge sundae. And again, they play this like really triumphant music when it's revealed. It's so dumb. I don't know why this is a thing. Like, what is Survivor's obsession over sundaes? But again, my favorite moment of the auction itself, again, plays into what I talked about earlier with the Amazon, where Chuigan ends up buying nachos. And Jan is the one to go up to the podium, and Jeff ends up saying it comes with something else. What goes with nachos? To which you immediately hear Jan say beer, followed by Helen saying tacos, and then Jeff just getting like really incensed over this. And then like Jan immediately says after enchiladas, which is just so dumb. It's really ridiculous. Like where at that point, obviously Jeff has to say margaritas. But again, to me, this is just such a humorous scene where it feels like every single time Jeff does try to do this sort of thing, ends up backfiring on him. But again, like for me, like this auction's mainly as high as it is because of how different it is. I think in terms of its baseline entertainment, it probably is a few spots lower, but it is one that really stands out to me and does have some humorous moments throughout. So again, here at number 7. Now number 6. This is an auction I struggled with where exactly to place it because this is an extremely notable auction to me. This is an auction that I feel like I remember from beginning to end, and it's an auction from my favorite season of all time, but it's also an auction that probably isn't as dynamic as it could have been, and that is the auction from Survivor Cagayan. And really, this is the first auction where you could tell a good chunk of people are holding back due to wanting advantages, like this and obviously Worlds Apart, which we'll talk about, which radically change the auction in the sense that production doesn't want to do it anymore because the game has gotten so game-centric. I still found this to be a really fun auction. Like obviously Tony, Spencer, Tasha don't end up getting any items because they're trying to go for advantages, but that leads to other people getting really cheap items, and to me that was like really fun as well. I mean, we instantly see Trish getting candy and popcorn, eating a gummy and really relishing in that. She later calls the entire tribe cheapo depots, which is always a funny line to me. We also have Wu getting some notable moments here, like when Jeffro wins a quesadilla with guacamole. We have Wu saying, get a fat dip of that guac. We also obviously have his rib scene, which is one of the most ridiculous scenes in the history of the show, with Jeff really like hyping Wu up for the ribs and him saying, it'll be immaculate all in my mouth. And there being this like sexy music as there's this like really awkward conversation between Jeff and Wu as he's biting into the ribs. It's so weird. But again, the auction does end with a pretty prolonged section about the advantage where Jeff calls out Tony, Spencer, and Tasha for not buying anything. We had a change in rules for how the auction operates where beforehand it had been stated that the first person to go to 500 gets the item. Here they changed it to where anyone that bids 500 is essentially bidding for a chance to win the item. And here we have Tony and Spencer both going for it, and they draw rocks for the advantage, which ends up being an idle clue. And Tony ends up getting it. And like, this is a pretty notable segment, but I don't know how entertaining it really is. Though it is interesting to me that Jeff immediately afterwards asked Tony, like, so you were never going to bid for food? Which to me kind of screamed out like his first realization of like, oh, the auction is broken, which probably ends up changing production stance on it moving forward. But again, like, I found this to be a fun auction, again, mostly because of Trish and Wu. I think those are like the two stars of the auction, and then obviously we do have how game-centric it becomes by the end of it. But again, like, it's probably not as consistent as the next 5 we'll be talking about. It's here number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to an auction that, I'll be honest, I kind of forgot about. I kind of forgot that this was a fun auction. I wasn't anticipating this one being that high, but again, it was a pretty good one. And at number 5, we do have the auction from Survivor One World. And again, this is one that has like a few notable moments sprinkled throughout. Obviously, there's a lot of fun character moments from Kat here. She initially gets this arc that typically happens in auctions around this time of people who aren't really willing to risk it and end up getting disappointed until she ends up buying a BLT, to which she says, yo, there's bacon on it, which obviously is a humorous line considering, again, it makes it clear she doesn't know what a BLT is, which is what she literally just bought. We also have Kim in the shower, which again, the show really tries to prop up, with Jeff keep on talking about, oh, the woman in the towels buying the peanut butter and chocolate and like all this other stuff. We get a fun moment from Tarzan and them talking about how he's not going to buy anything because he needs to repair the shocks in his Jeep, which is funny, only for him to obviously end up buying the letter from home, which ends up being a strong moment for him. But again, for me, the most notable moment from this auction is Troyzan and how confrontational he ends up being. Obviously, this is a point where Troyzan is on the bottom. This is my island episode where it really is just all about Troyzan, and we get Troy crying over not being able to buy a letter from home because he needs an advantage in the game, which I find funny that like the advantage ends up coming up and like Troy only bids 300 initially. It's like, why not go 500? Like, you know, you're getting the advantage. Like, why are you only going 300? Especially when like Christina also had $500 on her. But he ends up like slamming his fist on the podium when he gives Jeff his money. He gets into a fight with Sabrina over them trying to get Christina to go against him. Again, like, there's some fun moments here. The auction does end with the typical like Kat buying a cake and them getting 60 seconds to eat it. But again, like, to me, like, I felt like there were fun moments throughout. It was a fun auction as a whole. It's here number 5. Now number 4, moving on to an auction that, again, is probably the highest one on here for purely entertainment value. Again, I think this is a really fun auction as well, and that is the auction from Survivor Gabon. And again, I feel like this auction is mostly revolved around Randy and the hostility between him and Sugar, where right away Randy wants to buy beer and peanuts and Sugar ends up bidding against him just to up the price. And really, Randy ends up being like really aggressive in this auction, really bidding for like almost everything. And he ends up outbidding Randy to get the note that allows him to send anyone to exile, to which he ends up picking Bob. And through this, Kenny ends up having the most money for the rest of the auction, though, despite that he doesn't buy anything else, which is really weird, where he just like lets everyone else buy things, which I suspect was him essentially trying to do the same thing that Sugar just did to him and trying to up the price for everyone. But we get Susie winning the bath, to which Randy ends up bidding 100 to bathe her, which is just an awkward moment. This also leads to Susie like later like getting out of the bath before the auction is over, which seemed like a massive waste there. And you can even see like Jeff being confused over this. And you have like Kenny letting Sugar buy the PB and chocolate. You see Kenny letting go a burger and fries. You see Kenny letting go of the advantage in the immunity challenge, where Corinne ends up winning it instead, though too for Kenny ends up winning the challenge anyway. You see Kenny giving up spaghetti. It's like there's so many moments here where Kenny has the money to buy things, but then just lets other people get in. It turns out to be pretty good. But the auction does end with what's probably the best moment of the auction, which is Randy buying cookies for the entire tribe, to which Sugar ends up not taking one right away, but Randy decides to give his last cookie to Sugar, only for her to give it to Maddie, which ends up really upsetting him. But at the same time, I will say, like, even though I think Sugar acts pretty poorly here, I will say Randy was kind of a dick here too, where he's saying that I'm the boss. And also, you can clearly tell that Jeff is annoyed at Randy during the scene, because you can clearly tell the actual rules of this item were that every single person would get one cookie. So I think by how Randy was distributing the cookies and like giving some people an extra half and everything, I do think Jeff seemed to be annoyed by that. But again, it is funny that the auction ends with Randy saying Sugar can kiss my ass. And again, like I think this is a fun auction. Again, a lot of fun moments, largely because of the hostility between Randy and Sugar. But you also have some fun moments from Kenny and Susie along the way. It's here number 4. Now number 3, an auction that I kind of forgot was as good as it was. Again, this was one that didn't really stick to my mind, but again, I thought this was a pretty strong one, but largely because of how much of a game impact it ends up having as well. And at number 3, we do have Survivor Cook Islands. Now, this is a fun one just all around. Again, kind of similar to how Randy was acting in Gabon. We have Penner being a similar sort of figure here in Cook Islands, with him being really aggressive in the auction, buying a lot of things, pissing off people. We have a fun moment where he buys a hot dog and beer and he spills the beer on Adam. We have the first of the bath/shower rewards where Parvati ends up winning it here, which obviously the show plays up. We get some pooling of the money in order to buy a power in the game, to which Yul and Becky end up outbidding Candace and Adam, to which they are able to send someone to exile and take all the money, which Becky obviously sends Candace for the 4th straight time, which is fun, but also I do think this kind of breaks the auction, where I think this is probably the point where they realize that we can't have people pooling their money together, especially if we're going to have game advantages in the game. We get a never-ending ice cream machine, to which Ozzy bids $4.20, and Jeff says that's the magic number. And it's funny to see Ozzy, like, the first time he tries to get ice cream, he ends up squirting all over himself. Penner further pisses people off when he buys a pizza, and really he's just acting like really cocky across the entire thing. He spends the last of his money on a toothbrush and mouthwash, to which he gets it for $100, to which Jeff questions, do you even have $100? And Penner just says, I just bid it, which is, like, again, like a pretty good interaction between the two. To which Penner even ends up giving him a $20 tip at the end, which again really plays into the cockiness here. But to me, I feel like the main moment from this auction that stands out to me is Yul. Yul explaining where Jeff ends up mentioning that the idol could be on exile, to which Yul just decides to tell the tribe that he has the idol. To which Jeff tells him to show everyone, and Yul ends up pulling it out. And I mean, that kind of feels very intrusive there, but this does allow Yul to explain the Penner move, which I do think is a really good strategic moment for him, and him really allowing everyone to know for sure that he is like the strategic mastermind on the season. So to me, that's a notable moment there. So that mixed in with the like Candace exile and also Penner just being Penner across the auction, I decided to have Cook Islands here at number 3. Now number 2, and we're at the top 2 now, which are the top 2 for very different reasons. One is my favorite auction from a character standpoint. The other one's my favorite auction from a gameplay standpoint. And at number 2, I decided to put the gameplay one first, and here we do have Survivor Worlds Apart. And a major reason for that is that for me, the Survivor auction has always been more so about the character moments. I feel like the number 1 auction on the list should be one that represents the character moments that can stem from the auction, which makes me leave Worlds Apart behind here at number 2, even though I think it's probably the most important auction in the history of the show. It's one that really dictates the rest of the season, where through the move that Mike makes at this auction, it really ends up changing the power structure moving forward, and it starts this arc for Mike that makes him have to win out from this point forward, which he eventually does. But even outside of that, I mean, we also have the start of the Will and Shireen feud that comes from this auction, where Will ends up buying his way out of the auction, which ends up leading to him getting food back at camp, which eventually leads up to his fight with Shireen, which is also a pretty big moment for a season, even though that's probably more of a negative. This auction does also have Shireen really just kind of gaming the auction outside of that, where she just openly talks about how she's bidding because she doesn't want an advantage, and how when we get to the letters from home that we should only bid $20 because Jeff usually offers that price to everyone else as well. And like, again, like, I do think Shireen also played a major factor in why they stopped doing the auction here, where I do think Jeff just got kind of annoyed at how much they were gaming it. But really, like, the majority of this auction is actually fast forwarded. I mean, we really just blow through a whole bunch of items. Like, Jen gets this like massive cocktail, Sierra gets meat skewers, Rodney gets a steak. It's like they're really just blowing through this. as again, it is clear that Dan, Carolyn, and Mike are all going for the advantage, kind of similar to what happened in Cagayan. But again, like the main drama here comes from the letters, where once the letters comes up, Carolyn, Mike, and Dan make a deal to all go for it so they can all get letters and also still go for the advantage. But then Mike ends up turning back against it, which is also kind of a humorous scene, as you see like Mike being really conflicted on it, like as you see Dan at the front getting really emotional as he picks his letter up and talks about how much he misses his wife, which is again just funny to me. But yeah, Mike turns back, pisses off the tribe. Again, I think he was probably going to be targeted anyway, but this really makes him a social pariah from this point forward. But also would have been such a fascinating move if he actually went through with it. Obviously, he does go turn back on it and gets his letter instead, but so it would have been really fascinating to see what would have happened if he didn't do that. And then again, we see the advantage play out. They draw rocks. Dan gets the extra vote. And we end the auction with Dan talking about how Mike broke his heart, which is kind of humorous. Again, I'm Dan Foley. Like, as much as you can hate Dan Foley for him saying some very questionable things across the season, he is also such a ham for the camera. And I feel like that is something that adds to his humorous nature on the show. Again, like for me, Worlds Apart, definitely the most important auction in the history of the show in terms of how that season ended up playing out, but also really broke the auction to the point where we haven't seen it back. But again, I really enjoyed this sequence on the show. It's here number 2. Now number 1. The number 1 auction of all time, to me, again, is my favorite auction from a character standpoint. To me, this auction defines what an auction should be and what it was back in the day, and that is the auction from Survivor Africa. And to me, this is the auction I think of when I think of a Survivor auction. I love how this auction operates, where it really was more so up to the players, where I feel like after a certain point, the auction started to be a lot more stilted, where all you could do is just bid on your own and buy items for yourself. Well, here it felt like the players were able to do a lot more. Now, I will say a minor criticism here is I don't like them using shillings as the currency. It kind of made it a bit confusing. But again, they were allowed to pool money. They were allowed to barter even outside of buying the items. Or again, later on in the show, you can't even share items after you buy it. Here you can. And I think that opened it up for a lot of fun possibilities here. Again, to me, there's just so many fun moments throughout this auction. We started off with Big Tom wanting to get the beer, but Jeff starts the bidding at $4,000, to which Tom ends up saying, I'll only get it for $1,000, and Jeff actually allows him to do it. That's kind of funny. We have this battle between Kim Powers and Ethan and Tom for a sundae, to which Tom eventually gives up, but Ethan tells him to keep on going for it, though Kim Powers ends up eventually getting it anyway. We have Ethan trying to barter with her to pay $1,000 for a bite, to which she ends up saying $1,500. With Kim Johnson probably buying the best meal of the auction. It ends up being a major sticking point for the entire auction, where she ends up buying fried chicken and mashed potatoes, to which both Lex and Ethan try to make deals to get some of it, to which Kim Johnson ends up holding her own auction for a piece of chicken, to which T-Bird has this like big dilemma of her really wanting it, but she ends up holding out, and like Jeff even like kind of scolds her by saying, what are you waiting for? And she says fried chicken and potatoes, and he says like, it's right there. But we follow this up with T-Bird freaking out when she sees that there's a meatball sub, and she ends up winning that. And that segment ends with like T-Bird saying that it's good enough to slap your mama, which always felt like a ridiculous line. But again, like the most notable moment of the auction to me is probably one that isn't that politically correct anymore, but again, it's still a really fun scene of Tom and Ethan winning a mystery item, and like Tom doing this like fake out of Jeff doing him wrong when he sees it, only for it to be revealed that it's this massive breakfast, and then he ends up celebrating that Ethan is a Jew so he won't eat the ham. And again, that's just really fun. Again, like even though Big Tom is definitely not the most PC character nowadays, I do feel like moments like the ones that he brings to this auction are a lot of fun. And really just overall, I feel like this entire auction is a lot of fun. Like to me, when I think of a Survivor auction, the Survivor Africa auction is the one that I think of. It is the one that is the most memorable to me. So while there are other auctions that are more important to the landscape of the show and probably have more notable like individual moments within them, to me, Survivor Africa has always been one that has stuck out to me, and it is here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every Survivor auction. And I would like to do more rankings like this down the road for like individual like sort of events within Survivor history, for things that aren't just related to gameplay, which I feel like I've already focused on so much on this channel. So, and hopefully I'll do more of those down the road. Obviously, just expect more Survivor Big Brother stuff as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.